Hello, everyone. My name is Heather Wolfe. I did promise you guys I was going to read the first book of the series of Robyn Carr, What We Find, which is based on Sullivan's Crossing series on Netflix. So here we go. Here comes chapter 1 for you all. Maggie Sullivan sought refuge in the stairwell between the 6th and 7th floors at the far west end of the hospital. The steps least traveled by interns and residents racing from floor to floor. From emergency to emergency, she sat on the landing between two flights, feet on the stairs, arms crossed on her knees, her face buried in her arms. She didn't understand how her heart could feel as if it was breaking every day. She thought of herself as much stronger. Well, now some things never change, a familiar voice said. She looked up at her closest friend, J.C. Kent. They had gone to med school together, though residency had separated them. J.C. was an OB, and Maggie a neurosurgeon, and they had hidden in stairwells to cry all those years ago when med school life was kicking their asses. Most of their fellow students and instructors were men. They refused to let the men see them cry. Maggie gave a wet, burbly huff of laughter. "How'd you find me?" Maggie asked. "How do you know you're not in my spot?" "Because you're happily married and have a beautiful daughter?" "And my hours suck. I'm sleep-deprived, have as many bad days as good, and—" JC sat down beside Maggie. "And at least my hormones are cooperating at the moment." "Maggie, you're just taking call for someone, right? Just to stay ahead of the bills?" "Since the practice shut down," Maggie said, "and since the lawsuit was filed." "You need a break. You're recovering from a miscarriage and your hormones are wonky. You need to get away, especially away from the emergency room. Take some time off. Lick your wounds. Heal." "He dumped me," Maggie said. JC was clearly shocked. "What?" "He broke up with me. He said he couldn't take it anymore. My emotional behavior, my many troubles, he suggested professional help." JC was quiet. "I'm speechless," she finally said. "What a huge ass." "Well, I was crying all the time," she said, sniffing some more. "If I wasn't with him, I cried when I talked to him on the phone. I thought I was okay with the idea of no children. I'm almost 37. I work long hours. I was with a good man who was just off a bad marriage and already had a child. I'll give you everything, but the good man?" Jesus said. "He's a doctor. For God's sake, doesn't he know that all you've been through can take a toll? Remove all the stress and still have the miscarriage. People tend to treat a miscarriage like a heavy period, but it's a death. You lost your baby. You have to take time to grieve." "Gospel," Maggie said, rummaging for a tissue and giving her nose a hearty blow. "I really felt it on that level. When I found out I was pregnant, it took me about 15 minutes to start seeing the baby, loving her, or him. Not to beat a dead horse, but you have some hormone issues playing havoc on your emotions. Listen, shoot out some emails tonight. Tell the ones on the need-to-know list you're taking a week or two off. No one knows about the pregnancy but you and Andrew. You don't have to explain. Everyone knows about your practice, your ex-partners, the lawsuit. Frankly, your colleagues are amazed you're still standing. Get out of town or something. Get some rest." "You might be right," Maggie said. "These cement stairwells are killing me." JC put an arm around her. "Just like old times, huh?" The last 7 or 8 miles to Sullivan's Crossing was nothing but mud, and Maggie's cream-colored Toyota SUV was coated up to the window. This was not exactly a surprise. It had rained all week in Denver, now that she thought about it. March was typically the most unpredictable and sloppiest month of the year, especially in the mountains. If it wasn't rain, it could be snow. But Maggie had such a lousy year, the weather barely crossed her mind. Last year had produced so many medical, legal, and personal complications that her practice had shut down for a few months ago. She'd been picking up work from other practices, covering for doctors on call here and there, and working ER level 1 trauma while she tried to figure out how to untangle the mess her life had become. This, on her best friend and doctor's advice, was a much needed break. After sending a few emails and making a few phone calls, she was driving to her dad's house. She knew she was probably suffering from depression, exhaustion, and general misery. It would stand to reason. Her schedule could be horrific, and the tension had been terrible lately. It was about a year ago that 2 doctors in her practice had been accused of fraud and malpractice and suspended from seeing patients pending an investigation that would very likely lead to a trial. Even though she had no knowledge of the incidents, there was a scandal and it stank on her. There had been wild media attention, and she was left alone, trying to hold a wilting practice together. Then the parents of a boy who died from injuries sustained in a terrible car accident, while on her watch, filed a wrongful death suit against her. It seemed impossible fate could find one more thing to stack on her already teetering pile of troubles. Ha! Never challenge fate. She found out she was pregnant. It was an accident, of course. She'd been seeing Andrew for a couple of years. She lived in Denver, and he and Aurora, since they both had demanding careers, and they saw each other when they could, a night here, a night there. When they could manage a long weekend, it was heaven. She wanted more, but Andrew was an ER doctor and also the divorced father of an 8-year-old daughter, but they had constant phone contact, multiple texts and emails every day. She counted on him. He was her main support. Maggie wasn't sure she'd ever marry and have a family, but she was happy with her surprise. It was the one good thing in a bad year. Andrew, however, was not happy. He was still in divorce recovery, though it had been 3 years, and his ex still fought about support and custody and visits. Maggie didn't understand why. Andrew didn't seem to know what to do with his daughter when he had her. He immediately suggested terminating the pregnancy. He said they could revisit the issue in a couple of years if it turned out to be that important to her, and if the relationship was thriving. She couldn't imagine terminating just because Andrew was hesitant. She was 36. How much time did she have to revisit the issue? Although she hadn't told Andrew, she decided she was going to keep the baby, no matter what that meant for their relationship. Then she had a miscarriage. Grief-stricken and broken-hearted, she sank lower. Exactly. 2 people knew about the pregnancy and miscarriage, Andrew and JC. Maggie cried gut-wrenching tears every night. Sometimes she couldn't even wait to get home from work and started crying the second she pulled the car door closed. And there were those stairwell visits. She cried on the phone to Andrew, cried in his arms as he tried to comfort her, all the while knowing he was relieved. And then he'd said, "You know what, Maggie? I just can't do it anymore. We need a timeout. I can't prop you up, can't bolster you. You have to get some help. Get your emotional life back on track or something. You're sucking the life out of me, and I'm not equipped to help you." "Are you kidding me?" she had demanded. "You're dropping me when I'm down? When I'm only 3 weeks beyond a miscarriage?" And in typical Andrew fashion, he had said, "That's all I got, baby." It was really and truly the first moment she had realized it was all about him, and that was pretty much the last straw. She packed a bunch of suitcases. When she got packing, she couldn't seem to stop. She drove southwest from Denver to her father's house, south of Leadville and Fairplay, and she hadn't called ahead. She did call her mother Phoebe, just to say she was going to Sully's and she wasn't sure how long she'd stay. At the moment, she had no plan except to escape from that life of persistent strain, anxiety, and heartache. It was early afternoon when she drove up to the country store that had been her great-grandfather's, then her grandfather's, now her father's. Her father, Harry Sullivan, known by one and all as Sully, was a fit and hearty 70 and showed no sign of slowing down and no interest in retiring. She just sat in her car for a while, trying to figure out what she was going to say to him. How could she phrase it so it didn't sound like she just lost a baby and had her heart broken? Bo, her father's 4-year-old yellow lab, came trotting around the store, saw her car, starting running in circles, barking, then put his front paws up on her door, looking at her imploringly. Frank Masterson, a local who'd been a fixture at the store for as long as Maggie could remember, was sitting on the porch, nursing a cup of coffee with a newspaper on his lap. One glance told her the campground was barely occupied, only a couple of pop-up trailers and tents on campsites down the road toward the lake. She saw a man sitting outside his tent in a canvas camp chair, reading. She had expected the sparse population. It was the middle of the week, middle of the day, and the beginning of March, the least busy month of the year. Frank glanced at her twice, but didn't even wave. Bo trotted off, disappointed when Maggie didn't get out of the car. She still hadn't come up with a good entry line. 5 minutes passed before her father walked out of the store, across the porch, and down the steps. Bo following, she lowered the window. "Hi, Maggie," he said, on the car's roof, leaning on the car's roof. "Wasn't expecting you." It was spur of the moment. He glanced into her back seat at all the luggage. "How long are you planning to stay?" She shrugged. "Didn't you say I was always welcome? Anytime?" He smiled at her. "Sometimes I run off at the mouth. I need a break from work, from all that crap, from everything." "Understandable. What can I get you?" "Is it too much trouble to get 2 beers and a bed?" she asked, maybe a little sarcastically. "Core's okay by you?" "Sure." "Go on and park by the house. There's beer in the fridge, and I hadn't sold your bed yet." "That's gracious of you," she said. "You want some help to unload your entire wardrobe?" he asked. "Nope, I don't need much for now. I'll take care of it." "Then I'll get back to work, and we'll meet up later." "Sounds like a plan," she said. Maggie dragged only one bag into the house, the one with her toothbrush, pajamas, and clean jeans. When she was a little girl and both her parents and her grandfather lived on this property, she had been happy most of the time. The general store, the locals and campers, the mountains, lake and valley, wildlife, and sunshine kept her constantly cheerful. But the part of her that had a miserable mother, a father who tended to drink a little too much, and bickering parents, had been forlorn. Then, when she was 6, her mother had had enough of hardship. Rural living, driving Maggie a long distance to a school that Phoebe found inadequate. Throw in an unsatisfactory husband, and that was all she could take. Phoebe took Maggie away to Chicago. Maggie didn't see Sully for several years, and her mother married Walter Lancaster, a prominent neurosurgeon with lots of money. Maggie had hated it all. Chicago, Walter, the big house, the private school, the blistering cold and concrete landscape. She hated the sound of traffic and emergency vehicles. One thing she could recall in retrospect, it brought her mother to life. Phoebe was almost entirely happy, the only smudge on her brightness being her honorary daughter. They had switched roles. By the time Maggie was 11, she was visiting her dad regularly, first a few weekends, then whole months and some holidays. She lived for it, and Phoebe constantly held it over her. Behave yourself and get good grades, and you'll get to spend the summer at that god-awful camp, eating worms, getting filthy, and risking your life among bears. Why didn't you fight for me? She had continually asked her father. Oh, honey, Phoebe was right. I wasn't worth a damn as a father, and I just wanted what was best for you. It wasn't always easy, neither, he'd explained. Sometime in junior high, Maggie had made her peace with Walter, but she chose to go to college in Denver, near Sully. Phoebe's desire was that she go to a fancy Ivy League college. Med school and residency were a different story. It was tough, getting accepted at all. You went to the best career school and residency program that would have you. She ended up in Los Angeles. Then she did a fellowship with Walter, even though she hated going back to Chicago. But Walter was simply one of the best. After that, she joined a practice in Denver, close to her dad and the environment she loved. A year later, with Walter finally retired from his practice and enjoying more golf, Phoebe and Walter moved to Golden, Colorado, closer to Maggie. Walter was also 70, like Sully. Phoebe was a vibrant, social 59. Maggie thought she was possibly closer to Walter than to Phoebe, especially as they were both neurosurgeons. She was grateful. After all, he sent her to good private schools, even when she did every terrible thing she could to show him how unappreciated his efforts were. She had been a completely ungrateful brat about it, but Walter turned out to be a kind, classy guy. He had helped a great many people who proved to be eternally grateful, and Maggie had been impressed by his achievements. Plus, he mentored her in medicine. Loving medicine surprised her as much as anyone. Sully had said, I think it's a great idea. If I was as smart as you, and some old coot like Walter was willing to pick up the tab, I'd do it in a New York minute. Maggie found she loved science, but med school was the hardest thing she'd ever taken on. In most days, she wasn't sure she could make it through another week. She could have just quit, done a course correction, or flunked out, but no, she got perfect grades along with anxiety attacks. But the second they put a scalpel in her hand, she found her calling. She sat on Sully's couch, drank 2 beers, then lay down and pulled the throw over her. Bo pushed it through his doggy door and lay down beside the couch. The window was open, letting in the crisp, clean March air, and she dropped off to sleep, immediately to the rhythmic sound of Sully raking out a trench behind the house. She started fantasizing about summer at the lake, but before she woke, she was dreaming of trying to operate in a crowded emergency room where everyone was yelling. Bloody rags littered the floor. People hated each other, threw instruments at one another, and patients were dying one after another. She woke up panting, her heart hammering. The sun had set, and the kitchen light had been turned on, which meant Sully had been to the house to check on her. There was a sandwich covered in plastic wrap on a plate. A note sat beside it. It was written by Enid, Frank's wife. Enid worked mornings in the store, baking and preparing packaged meals from salads to sandwiches for campers and tourists. Welcome home, the note said. Maggie ate the sandwich, drank a 3rd beer, and went to bed in the room that was hers at her father's house. She woke to the sound of Sully moving around and saw that it was not quite 5 a.m., so she decided to go back to sleep until she didn't have anxiety dreams anymore. She got up at noon, grazed through the refrigerator's bleak contents, and went back to sleep. At about 2 in the afternoon, the door to her room opened noisily, and Sully said, All right, enough is enough. Sully's store had been built in 1906 by Maggie's great-grandfather, Nathaniel Greeley Sullivan, Nathaniel had a son and a daughter, married off the daughter and gave the son. Horace, the store. Horace had one son, Harry, who really had better things to do than run a country store. He wanted to see the world and have adventures, so he joined the army and went to Vietnam, among other places. But at the age of 33, he finally married and brought his pretty young wife Phoebe home to Sullivan's Crossing. They immediately had one child, Maggie, and settled in for the long haul. All of the store owners have been called Sully, but Maggie was always called Maggie. The store had once been the only place to get bread, milk, thread, or nails within 20 miles, but things had changed mightily by the time Maggie's father had taken it on. It had become a recreational facility, 4 one-room cabins, dry campsites, a few RV hookups, a dock on the lake, a boat launch, public bathrooms with showers, coin-operated laundry facilities, picnic tables, and grills. Sully had installed a few extra electrical outlets on the porch so people in tents could charge their electronics, and now Sully himself had satellite TV and Wi-Fi. Sullivan's Crossing sat in a valley south of Ladeville at the base of some stunning mountains and just off the Continental Divide Trail. The camping was cheap and well managed, the grounds were clean, the store large and well stocked. They had a post office. Sully was the postmaster, and now it was the closest place to get supplies, beer, and ice for locals and tourists alike.